subject of today's stream. Interesting essay in the New York Times about how our lifespan has doubled essentially over the past 2 centuries. So it begins by talking about the Spanish flu of 1918, great New York Times condensation of this forthcoming book. And it notes that as many as 100 million people may well have died from the Spanish flu. So we've had about 5 million die from COVID-19, and the world population's increased about 5 times since then. But the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, approximately 100 million people died. This is from a new book called Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer, and it's also a 4-part PBS-BBC series of the same title. And one dramatic difference between the Spanish flu of 1918 and COVID-19 is that the Spanish flu was unusually lethal among young people. So in the United States, overnight, average life expectancy plunged from 40 to 47 from 54. In England and Wales, it fell more than a decade, from 54 to 41. And India experienced average life expectancies below 30 years. So, knowing the toll that the Spanish flu would take on global life expectancy, what forecast would you have made for the next 100 years? Was the progress of the previous half-century merely a fluke, easily overturned by military violence, the increased risk of pandemics in an age of global connection? Was the Spanish flu a preview of an even darker future in which some rogue virus could collapse civilization itself? None of these grim scenarios came to pass. What followed the Spanish flu was a century of unexpected life. So the period from 1916 to 1920 marked the last point in which a major reversal in global life expectancy would be recorded. So the descendants of English and Welsh babies born in 1918, who on average lived just 41 years, today enjoy life expectancies in the 1980s. Now, these low life expectancies are incredibly distorted by the number of babies who died. So once you reach the age of 5, over the past few thousand years, you are likely to live into your 60s. All right, so once you survive those first few years, your life expectancy 500,000, 2,000 years ago was going to be approximately close to as long as what we have now. So we have a hard time recognizing this kind of progress because it's measured not in events, but in movements. The smallpox infection that did not kill you at age 2, the accidental scrape that no longer gives you a lethal bacteria infection, the drinking water that does not poison you with cholera. So human beings, we have been increasingly protected by an invisible shield, one that has been built piece by piece over the last few centuries, keeping us ever safer and further from death. And it's a shield that's primarily being built by elites, and often elites with a globalist perspective. So this shield protects us through countless interventions, the chlorine in our drinking water, the ring of vaccinations that rid the world of smallpox, the data centers mapping new outbreaks around the planet. So how did this great doubling of the human lifespan happen? There were 3 critical breakthroughs: vaccines, germ theory, antibiotics. So the breakthroughs were all initiated by scientists, but it took the work of activists, public intellectuals, legal reformers, journalists to bring these benefits to everyday people. So the doubling of human lifespan is an achievement closer to something like universal suffrage or the abolition of slavery, progress that required new social movements, new forms of persuasion, new kinds of public institutions to take root, and it required lifestyle changes that ran through all echelons of society: washing hands, quitting smoking, getting vaccinated, wearing masks during a pandemic. So the end result is not one of those visible icons of modernity, such as a skyscraper, a moon landing, a fighter jet, a smartphone, manifesting countless achievements, often quickly forgotten: drinking water that's free from cholera, vaccines received in early childhood, never thought about again. These achievements are so myriad and subtle that we tend not to think about them. And 2 episodes of this documentary is already played on PBS. Yeah, I don't understand being anti-vaccine. That just seems insane to me. All the evidence suggests that vaccines are overwhelmingly healthy, prolong people's lives. The upside of taking a vaccine so dramatically...
David's in the UK.
So I criticize globalists and elites a lot on this show, but it's important to put it in context. Just because you're elite or a globalist doesn't mean that you're always wrong. And this is one example of the huge benefits that globalists and elites have given to us. They're not just doing evil things. Even China, in its response to COVID-19 pandemic, they didn't only interfere and make things worse. They did some things that helped us. They looked at the DNA, the genome of the COVID virus. They put it online, and that enabled us to develop vaccines very quickly. So for most of human history, global life expectancy has rarely exceeded a ceiling of about 35 years. That's heavily distorted. If you made it past age 5, you were very likely to make it into your 50s and 60s. So life expectancy in history would rise or fall depending on the harvest or a disease outbreak, but it never showed long-term signs of improvement. Now, this is not just true of average life expectancy. Until about the 19th century, human progress was seemingly infinitesimal. You could take someone from 4,000 years ago and drop them in 1750 London, and life would still make sense to them. But if you drop them in 1850 London, life would be absolutely unfathomable. So the Industrial Revolution caused a complete explosion in the way that life works. But until about 1800, any visible signs of progress were so slow that you could take a figure from 1,000 years previous, 2,000 years previous, 5,000, 10,000 years previous, drop them in 1780 London, and they'd be off to Grocket. All right, it wouldn't be that shocking. But by 1820, there had been enormous changes due to the Industrial Revolution. So the key factor keeping average life expectancy low was the shockingly high rates of infant and child mortality. 2 in 5 children perished before reaching adulthood. Humans had spent 10,000 years inventing agriculture, gunpowder, double entry accounting, perspective in painting, but they'd been unable to move the needle in one critical category: how long the average person could expect to live. So the first hint that this ceiling might be broached appeared where? It appeared in Britain during the middle decades of the 18th century, just as the Enlightenment and industrialization were transforming European and North American societies. So right around 1750, the average life expectancy of a British aristocrat began to increase at a steady rate. So until about 1840, the rich in England had more children than the poor. After 1840, the poor started having more children than the rich. So by the 1770s, the British elite were living on average into their mid-40s. By the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, they were approaching a life expectancy at birth of 60. But remember, if they made it to age 5 in the 1770s or age 5 by 1850, they were very likely to live into their 60s. Now, these British aristocrats constituted a tiny proportion of humanity, but the demographic transformation they experienced offered a glimpse of the future. It marked the beginning of a measurable gap in health outcomes. So before 1750, it didn't matter whether you're a baron or a street sweeper or a hunter-gatherer, your life expectancy at birth was going to be in the 30s. So all the wealth and privilege that gave European elites no advantages whatsoever at the elemental task of keeping themselves and their children alive. So European royalty died just like European proles by smallpox viruses, for example. Now, how did the British elite manage that first sustained extension in average lifespan? So probably point to Edward Jenner's invention of the smallpox vaccine, which ranks alongside Newton's apple and Franklin's kite among the most familiar narratives in the history of science. So his invention occurred in May of 1790. So in 1843, a British statistician compared life expectancies in 3 parts of England: rural Surrey, metropolitan London, and industrial Liverpool. Found that people in Surrey enjoyed life expectancies of 50. In London, life expectancies were stuck at 35, and the average Liverpudlian died at 25. The mortality trends in the United States during the first half of the 19th century were equally stark. So overall, life expectancy in the United States declined by 13 years between 1800 and 1850. In 1815, 30% of all reported deaths in New York were children under 5. By the middle of the century, it was more than 60%. And the culprit was clear. It was in milk, cow's milk, right? So you hear some people trying to make the case for raw milk, but it was pasteurization of milk that was largely responsible for an enormous boom in life expectancy. There are all sorts of fatal diseases linked to milk, including diphtheria, typhoid, scarlet fever. So eventually Louis Pasteur discovered pasteurization, where you would quickly heat wine or milk to kill bacteria. So just heat milk to around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, then quickly cool it. And you can do that without substantially affecting its flavor. It is this technique applied to milk all around the world that saves countless people of dying of disease every day. So it wasn't just the invention. Then you had to have politicians and journalists and activists make the case for making this mandatory. So there was one man in particular, a department store impresario named Nathan Strauss. He lived in the American South. He lost 2 children to disease. And when he learned about pasteurization, he saw that this was a simple intervention that would keep many children alive. And the widespread belief at the time was that pasteurized milk just didn't have the flavor of raw milk. I remember in my home, I think my father was a big advocate of raw milk. So Pasteur created a milk laboratory where sterilized milk could be produced at scale, and then he developed all these milk depots in low-income neighborhoods where milk was sold below cost. And he supplied sterilized milk to an orphanage where half of the children used to perish in less than 3 years. Almost immediately, the mortality rate dropped by 14%. So he started an extended campaign to outlaw unpasteurized milk. It was ferociously opposed by the milk industry and its representatives. His advocacy attracted the attention of President Theodore Roosevelt, who ordered an investigation into the health benefits of pasteurization. And in 1909, Chicago became the first major American city to require pasteurization. And eventually by the 1920s, more and more cities around the United States were requiring pasteurized milk. So pasteurized milk was one of a number of mass inventions that triggered the first egalitarian rise in life expectancy. By the first decade of the 20th century, average lifespans in England and the United States had passed 50 years. Millions of people in industrialized nations found themselves in a genuinely new cycle of positive health trends, what you could call the Great Escape, breaking through the ceiling that had limited Homo sapiens for the life of the species. And this trend continued with a dip for the Spanish flu. But for every 100 human beings born in New York City for most of the 19th century, fewer than 60 would make it to adulthood. Today, 99 out of 100 human beings born in New York City make it into adulthood. Now, why was this great escape from early mortality so egalitarian? Because it was propelled by globalist elites, by infrastructure advances that benefited the entire population, not just the elites. So in the first decades of the 20th century, people in cities all around the world began consuming microscopic amounts of chlorine in their drinking water. So in sufficient doses, chlorine is a poison. In very small doses, it is harmless to humans, but lethal to bacteria that cause diseases like cholera. So once you started quietly adding chlorine to public reservoirs, you drastically cut down on diseases such as cholera. So by 1914, more than 50% of public water customers were drinking disinfected water, saving lives on a massive scale. So in 1908, typhoid was responsible for 30 deaths per 100,000 people. 3 decades later, that death rate had been reduced by a factor of 10. So the rise of chlorination, like the rise of pasteurization, were on one hand the triumph of applied chemistry, but it was acting on the chemistry. It was the painstaking effort of turning these inventions into widespread use. This required the work of thousands of people in professions such as sanitation reformers, local health boards, waterworks engineers, journalists to make the case, elites to push it. So these people, thousands of people, quietly labored to transform America's drinking water from one of the great killers of modern life to a safe and reliable form of hydration. And this increase in life expectancy was also enhanced by the explosion of vaccine development in the early part of the 20th century. So public health reform started getting vaccines into people's arms. Whooping cough vaccine was developed in 1914, tuberculosis in 1921, diphtheria in 1923, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine in the early 1950s. So the first stage of the Great Escape from early mortality was not propelled primarily by medical drugs. Vaccines could protect you from future infections, but if you actually got sick, there was very little that medical science could do for you until you had the development of penicillin, which occurred during World War II. So after World War II, you started having an explosion of medical drugs that could make a substantial difference to people who were already sick.
Is to show the body.
So there are positive trends in the world today as well as negative trends. So remember house calls? When I was a kid, when I got very sick, the doctor would make house calls. So some ways we're worse off. You don't have as many doctors making house calls, but we have all sorts of technological advances in healthcare as well. So penicillin, along with other antibiotics developed soon after World War II, they triggered a revolution in human health. Mass killers like tuberculosis were almost entirely eliminated. People stopped getting severe infections from simple cuts and scrapes. Magical power of antibiotics to ward off infection opened the door to new treatments. Radical surgical procedures like organ transplants became mainstream. Physicians now had genuinely useful drugs to prescribe. Antibiotics were joined by, say, antiretroviral drugs that saved so many HIV-positive people from death sentence of AIDS. You got statins and ACE inhibitors used to treat heart disease. Now a new regime of immunotherapies that hold the promise of curing certain forms of cancer for good. Hospitals are no longer places we go to die, offering nothing but bandages and cold comfort. So these medical breakthroughs were propelled by the statistical breakthrough of randomized controlled trials, RCTs. Developed for the first time in the late 1940s, they allowed researchers to test the efficacy of experimental treatments or to detect health risks from dangerous pollutants. So the methodology of these randomized controlled trials allowed private companies and government agencies to determine empirically whether a given drug worked. In the early 1960s, Congress passed the landmark Kefauver-Harris drug amendments, which extended the demands made on new drug applicants. First time, drug companies would be required to supply proof of efficacy. Wasn't enough for Big Pharma to offer evidence that they had listed the right ingredients on the label. They had to show proof from trials that their supposed cures actually worked better than the placebo effect. The decade following the mass production of antibiotics marked the most extreme moment of lifespan inequality globally. In 1950, life expectancy in India, most of Africa, had barely budged from the long ceiling of around 35 years, while the average American or European could expect to live till about 70. So it took Sweden 150 years to reduce childhood mortality rates from 30% to under 1%. Post-war South Korea pulled off this same feat in 40 years. India has doubled its life expectancy in 70 years. Many African nations have done the same. In 1951, the lifespan gap that separated China and the United States was more than 20 years. Now it is just 2 years. So what's behind these trends? We've got increasing standards of living. We've got decreases in famine. We've got the invention of artificial fertilizer and the Green Revolution. We've got imported medicines and infrastructures, antibiotics, chlorinated drinking water. Many interventions have come from the global south, such as oral rehydration therapy. So cholera victims were known to lose as much as 30% of their body weight through expelled fluids in just a matter of hours. But by hydrating them with water mixed with sugar and salt, it would keep them alive. So it's low tech, not terribly complicated, and it's been now replicated all around the world by various globalist organizations like UNICEF and the World Health Organization. So 50 million people died of cholera in the 19th century. In the first decades of the 21st century, fewer than 66,000 people died on a planet with 8 times the population. So of all the achievements that brought the great escape to the entire world, one stands out: the vanquishing of smallpox. And the World Health Organization helped to make these vaccines worldwide available, thus largely wiping out smallpox. So another key breakthrough was the development of institutions like the World Health Organization, WHO, and the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. Starting in the mid-1960s, the WHO worked with hundreds of thousands of health workers who oversaw surveillance of vaccinations in more than 40 countries still suffering from smallpox outbreak. So this international body would organize the activity of so many people all over the world. This would have been unthinkable in the more nationalistic 19th century. So with chlorination, oral rehydration therapy, smallpox eradication was a triumph of organization, globalism. So locating smallpox outbreaks in countries as vast as India was a feat of staggering complexity. So it required thousands of district health personnel, more than 100,000 field workers. So field workers would visit each of the country's 100 million households in India to trace the remaining spread of the virus. Now, of course, longer lifespans leads to increased population, but population growth is slowing. So the world population should stabilize at something around 12 billion. China, for example, is on a course to halve its population in the next 80 years. So currently there are over 1.4 billion Chinese. In 2100, there will be about 740 million Chinese.
Right.
And then when it sees it,
Of only the spike.
You can still pull it off. All right, this is Stephen Johnson, who's doing this great BBC documentary, Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer. And he has a long essay in the New York Times this
Good evening.
weekend.
I'm Stonich, the executive director of FAN, and I'm incredibly excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Stephen Johnson and Dr. James Hamblin. Thanks for attending.
16 years ago called the Ghost Map, which is about, arguably the most famous story in certainly epidemiology, which is about how the Victorian Dr. John Snow solved the mystery of where cholera was coming from, and through kind of amazing detective work, shifted the public understanding of cholera from being a miasma-driven disease to something that was being transmitted in the water, which was a major breakthrough in public health. And one of the reasons that I've written that book is that I wanted to remind people how much progress we'd made in a relatively short amount of time. That book takes place in 1854 mostly, and that was only at the time I was writing it 150 years before, basically. And
So the energy for doing live streams and for talk radio is generally, let's be honest, it's playing to male hysteria, to a significant portion of viewership's playing to male hysteria, that things are getting worse and worse, that there's no hope, that all trends are bad, that the globalist elites are out to screw you. And it's just not true. And I think it's usually reflective of something deeper, people whose lives are not working. Now, there's also a substantial audience for people whose lives are working, and they want to build on the things that are good in their lives, and they want to become informed about threats to the quality of their life. And so what's the difference between hysteria and logical, rational concern? And that is effectiveness, right? Someone who's effective is generally not hysterical, and people who are hysterical are generally not effective. So the globalist outlook has its problems, and American elites, European elites have certainly done a lot of bad things, and they have many members. There are many members of the elite who still pose, say, a significant threat to the type of America that you want. On the other hand, I think we need to face up that the elites have also done some good things, and that globalism, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the Centers for Disease Control, that innovative science breakthroughs, and then public health breakthroughs pushing mass immunization, mass vaccination, fluoridating water, pushing people to get vaccinated, making sure that milk is pasteurized, that these these globalist, elitist programs have done a massive amount of good.
The reality of life in a big city back then was that you could drink a glass of water and be dead of a terrible intestinal disease within 72 hours, and it just happened all the time. And so it was a reminder. It was intended to be a kind of antidote to our historical amnesia that we have about progress in medicine and health, that we forget how many threats have been eliminated. And so that was always that book actually is kind of the best selling of all my books, and that kind of message of reminding people about this kind of progress is always something that I think is important to do. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I started thinking that maybe it would be interesting to structure basically a history book where the subject matter was not, a great political leader or a military conflict or a social movement, but a number, kind of a demographic number that really measured how, monumental change was happening in society. And I knew that there had been a kind of rough doubling of life expectancy globally from the end of the Spanish flu, around 1919, 1920. To the present day, depending on how you measure it. In the United States, it goes from 42 to about 77 or 78. Globally, it probably goes from something like 35 to 72 over that period. The numbers are a little bit blurry, but it's effectively a doubling. Yeah. And so 4 years ago, when I came up with this idea, I thought, well, there will be a nice historical peg, because the book will probably come out in 2020 or 2021. And I was hoping there would be a TV series. And it would be the 100th anniversary of the end of the Spanish flu. And so it would have a nice kind of historical rhyme to it, that this story of progress in human health, really, I think the most amazing thing that we've ever pulled off as a species, that we were able to kind of double the average lifespan in that period, that it would be on the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu would be a nice kind of timing for it. And I'd always thought that one of the opening chapters and that the opening episode, if we were able to make a TV series, would be about vaccines and about mass vaccination, because that's a big part of the progress in human health. So that was all in my head like 4 years ago. And then 2020 happened. And suddenly everything that I've been writing as this history of 100 years of progress, all of the themes of the book, the importance of public health, the importance of using data in tracking epidemics, the importance of mass vaccination, the importance of clinical trials to determine the efficacy of new drugs and treatments, everything was just front page news. And in fact, the television series we made entirely post-COVID. I'd written the book mostly pre-COVID and kind of updated it in the final version. But the show was made entirely in late 2020, early 2021. And so it is, I've kind of come to think of it as like a 200-year history of right now. Like that, everything is kind of, that is the most urgent things in the world right now are kind of woven through this history, which is when you write about history, you don't often get that opportunity to have the present be so, or have the past be so animated by the present with this project. So I wish it were timely for happier reasons, but this is where we are.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask about the pandemic, of course, because it's